In partnership with DailyDoseDocumentary.com and PlatosPeach.com, Timelines in History presents the Second World War. Mein Kampf. After his failed attempt to take control of the Bavarian government in an infamous coup d'etat, Adolf Hitler wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf during his confinement at Landsberg prison, dictated by his loyal friend and fellow revolutionary Rudolf Hess. Translated into the English as My Struggle, Hitler's autobiographical Mein Kampf reminisces about his time in Vienna, when at first he was tolerant of the Jews and Slavs he met there, dismissing the anti-Semitic press as unworthy of his consideration. As his 400-plus page diatribe presses on, however, Hitler's views about Jews and non-Aryan races would devolve into full-on racism, furthering the long-standing fabrication about a Jewish plot to control the world. In Hitler's view, the German state was not an economic or social entity, but a racial one, affirming that the only way to revitalize Germany was an insistence on Aryan purity and the removal of non-Aryan races. He also called for Lebensraum, or living space, which saw the need for Germany to expand eastward into Russia by pushing out or eradicating the Slavic people. Hitler went on to write that the nationalization of our masses will succeed only when, aside from all the positive struggle for the soul of our people, their international poisoners are exterminated, making a clear reference to his future plans for a final solution. While Hitler's first volume of Mein Kampf was published in 1925 to little fanfare or sales, his second volume, published in 1927 to equally unimpressive sales, focused on his views on National Socialism and the need for a lone authoritarian dictator to steer the course of a revitalized Germany. Mein Kampf's dismal sales numbers tipped upwards after Hitler came to power in 1933, rising so dramatically in popularity and sales that newly married couples were generally given a copy as a wedding gift, filling Hitler's personal coffers with $27 million in royalties in today's currency. Once in power, Hitler tried to distance himself from Mein Kampf in a number of published articles, dismissing the volumes as his fantasies behind bars, making Mein Kampf an early indicator of the horrors to come. The Reichstag Fire. As Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party gained strength in the late 1920s, the Nazis played on widespread discontent with the ruling Weimar Republic, not to mention Germany's pressing economic woes caused by their defeat in reparation payments following the First World War. In response to his dwindling support, in 1933, war hero and now Weimar President Paul von Hindenburg reluctantly appointed Hitler Chancellor of Germany in an effort to build a right-wing coalition against his far-left opponents. In response, the Nazis quickly suppressed their political opponents, issuing a February 4th decree for the protection of the German people, which effectively muzzled the German press and banned political marches and assemblies, at the same time raiding Communist Party headquarters in Berlin, before falsely claiming to have found seditious pamphlets encouraging an armed communist revolt. In retaliation, on the night of February 27th, the Reichstag, or German parliament, was set ablaze, destroying its gilded cupola and main chamber, causing $1 million in damage, or some $24 million in today's currency, before firefighters could extinguish the flames. Police arrested Marinus van der Lubbe at the scene, an unemployed Dutch laborer with known communist sympathies, who in turn confessed to setting the fire as an encouragement for a workers' uprising against the Weimar Republic. tried in January of 1934, alongside 4 other communist members, van der Lubbe was convicted and beheaded before the close of the month. In its wake, the Reichstag Fire ignited national fears of a communist takeover, obliging Hitler to convince Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, effectively handing the Führer dictatorial power over Germany. Hitler and his cabinet wasted no time drawing up a more permanent and expansive doctrine known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, which outlawed the right of assembly, freedom of the press, and freedom of speech. At the same time, removing restraints on police investigations, which led to the arrest, torture, and imprisonment of some 4,000 people. Hitler's brutal response to the Reichstag fire, some historians have fingered the Nazis themselves as the cause of the blaze, elevated Hitler's image as a resolute savior from the dreaded Bolsheviks, leading to a Reichstag assembly on the night of March 23rd, hastily passing the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler full dictatorial power over Germany. And when the ailing Hindenburg died later that year, the German army sanctioned Hitler as both president and chancellor, setting the stage for the horrors to come during the Second World War. Hitler's Olympic Games. For 2 weeks in August 1936, athletes descended upon Berlin for the 11th Olympic Games. Visitors and athletes alike were warmly welcomed, but behind the pomp and pageantry were ominous signs of a Nazi regime gone bad. The swastika was openly displayed on banners around town and at the Olympic Stadium, while the German sense of Aryan supremacy was a hard thing to conceal. After the aggressions displayed by the Germans during World War I, Hitler and his propaganda machine used the Olympics as a way to present a kinder, gentler image to a largely skeptical world. Off the field, the truth about what the Nazis were up to was hard for foreigners to miss. By 1936, Jews and other minorities had been openly stripped of their civil rights and even their citizenship, while Jewish-owned businesses were forced to display the Star of David on their storefronts. History would later reveal that the Nazis had already opened their first concentration camp by the time the Games began. Prior to the start of the Games, debate raged in the U.S. and other participating countries about whether to attend at all. But in the end, 49 nations, including the United States, came to Germany to compete. And at the opening ceremonies, visiting athletes and spectators alike witnessed Aryan athletes follow in the footsteps of ancient Greeks, bringing fire from Mount Olympus in the first ever Olympic torch relay. Popular history remembers Jesse Owens' 4 gold medals, an Olympic first for any athlete, no doubt causing great embarrassment to the Germans' belief in their Aryan supremacy. The Games also stood as a major corruption to the ideals sacred to the Olympic Games, creating an illusion of a peaceful and tolerant nation that was the farthest thing from the truth. 3 years later, Nazi stormtroopers would blitzkrieg into Poland, setting off 6 years of war that would cost the lives of 60 million people. How Detroit outbuilt her enemies during World War II. When Allied troops landed at Normandy during the D-Day invasions of France, the invasion force included 50,000 vehicles of all types, well over 5,000 ships, and more than twice that number in airplanes. While many factors led up to victory, in both theaters of war, one key element was the ability of American industry to outbuild Germany and Japan in the largest mechanized war the world has ever seen. Detroit automakers played a key role in the Allies' victory when they switched from building cars to building the machinery of modern warfare. For example, Ford's enormous Willow Run plant produced a total of 8,685 B-24 heavy bombers, outputting 1 plane per hour by early 1945. Due to the use of interchangeable parts, Willys Overland, Ford, and Bantam produce more than 1.3 million Jeeps, or Blitz buggies as they were affectionately known. Just before his death in 1945, famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle wrote of the Jeep, "Good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything, it goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat." Detroit also provided the war effort with a steady supply of tanks from Chrysler's enormous Detroit Arsenal tank plant, including 3,352 M3 tanks and 17,947 M4 Sherman Series tanks, or approximately 36% of the total 49,234 Sherman tanks built for the war effort. General Motors also joined the fight by constructing 21,000 amphibious landing craft known as duck boats, costing the U.S. government $10,800 for each amphibious vehicle rolling off GM's assembly lines. GM also produced an arsenal of other war materiel, including nearly 120 million artillery shells, over 39 million cartridge casings, 206,000 aircraft engines, 13,000 Navy fighter planes, 854,000 transport trucks, and nearly 2 million machine guns. With the fate of the free world at stake, Detroit and its surrounding industrial communities played heavily into America's quest to outbuild Hitler and Hirohito, allowing American industrial might to play a starring role in the Allies' eventual victories over Nazi and Japanese aggression. The MidAtlantic Gap. During the early years of the Second World War, before the Allies had deciphered the Germans' Enigma code or developed air-to-surface radar, Hitler's U-boats wreaked havoc on North America's ability to resupply the British with desperately needed war assets and basic supplies. Known respectively as the MidAtlantic Gap, the Greenland Gap, the Black Pit, or simply the Gap, by the fall of 1942, some 2,000 ships had been lost to German U-boat attacks, who hunted in groups known as wolf packs, sending thousands of merchant seamen to unmarked graves in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. Losing more ships than Allied shipyards could produce, Allied war leaders saw the writing on the wall. Without an effective stop to the U-boat threat, Great Britain would be forced to sue for peace under the relentless vice of Nazi aggression. Emboldened by their early success in the MidAtlantic Gap and fully aware that they could win the war by cutting off Britain's vital supply chain, the situation worsened in May of 1942 when a swarm of German U-boats entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the inland waters of the St. Lawrence River, sinking 21 ships with relative ease. Using a strategy born in World War I, merchant ships formed massive convoys before steaming across the 1,000-mile Mid-Atlantic Gap, escorted by Allied naval warships who kept a vigilant eye out for marauding U-boats. Even so, losses remained egregiously high until Allied ingenuity combined with its tactical, industrial, and technological might to crush the U-boat threat once and for all. In early 1943, the Allies established air bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Greenland in an effort to extend air support over the Gap, at the same time employing long-range bombers like the B-24 Liberator, equipped with first-of-its-kind air-to-surface radar systems, which could penetrate the perpetual fog over the Grand Banks that gave U-boats their early advantage. Increased reconnaissance and anti-submarine patrols, combined with advances in anti-sub warfare techniques, employing sonar and new depth charge systems, severely biting into the Germans' ability to sink Allied ships, which ultimately closed the Mid-Atlantic Gap by May of 1943, making victory over the Black Pit a crucial turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, and ultimately the eventual outcome of the Second World War. Sinking the SS Athenia. Launched in 1923, the British passenger liner SS Athenia sailed under the Donaldson Atlantic Line with transatlantic accommodations for 1,000 passengers, and on the evening of September 1, 1939, the same day Germany invaded Poland, the SS Athenia departed Glasgow, Scotland for Montreal, Canada, with a cargo of 1,103 relieved passengers, desperate to flee yet another war in Europe. Making stops in Belfast and Liverpool to take on additional passengers, on September 3rd, mere hours after British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain declared a state of war with Germany, at 7:30 p.m., the 26-year-old captain of U-30, Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, gave the order to fire upon the unarmed passenger liner. During the slow 14-hour sinking of the SS Athenia, the HMS Electra and 2 other destroyers were able to rescue the majority of the passengers and crew aboard the doomed ocean liner, save for 93 passengers, including 85 women and children, and 19 crew members, who were either lost in the initial explosion or died in mishandled lifeboats, making the SS Athenia the first British ship to go down in the Second World War. As the youngest captain in the Third Reich's Kriegsmarine, Lemp had been trained to observe the German Navy's prize rules based on international law, which required U-boat commanders to forewarn merchant vessels of an impending attack. Instead, Lemp would later claim that the SS Athenia had been acting suspiciously, employing zigzag defensive maneuvers with her portholes blacked out. Soon after his order to fire upon the passenger ship, Lemp would discover the truth behind his blunder by listening to a BBC broadcast, further compounding his mistake by extending his patrol for an additional 3 more weeks. After Lemp returned to base to confess in private to Kriegsmarine Commodore Karl Dönitz, Dönitz and other German war leaders accepted the fact that Lemp may have made an egregious error under the heat of battle, furthering their cover-up by crudely inserting a fake page into the U-30's logbook regarding Lemp's report of events on September 3rd. Not only did Lemp avoid court-martial for disobeying orders, but the German Navy awarded the aggressive submariner with the Iron Cross Second-Class Medal and a promotion to lieutenant commander. Lemp later took the helm of U-110, which in May of 1941 was attacked by British warships and forced to the surface. While Lemp went down with his ship, his surviving crew failed to scuttle their badly damaged U-boat, allowing a still-functional Enigma cipher machine to fall into Allied hands, a turning point moment which later allowed the Allies to intercept and decipher German radio commands, making the sinking of SS Athenia the first innocent maritime casualties in a long and bloody war. The Codebreakers of World War II. Born in London in 1912, brilliant mathematician Alan Turing studied at both Cambridge and Princeton before joining the British government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, where top-secret work was carried out to decipher the military codes used by the Axis nations. The main focus of Turing's work at Bletchley was to crack the Enigma code, a type of enciphering machine used by the German armed forces to send secure messages between troop field commands as well as naval vessels at sea. Although Polish mathematicians had worked out how to read Enigma messages and had shared their knowledge with the British before the Nazis rolled into Poland, the Germans increased security measures at the outbreak of war by changing their cipher system daily. This made the task of breaking the code exponentially more difficult. Along with fellow codebreaker Gordon Welchman, Turing played a key role in breaking the Nazis' code by developing a machine called the bomb, which significantly reduced the work of breaking the ever-changing German code. Turing then went on to decipher the more complex Enigma code used by the German Navy, whose U-boats were inflicting heavy losses on Allied shipping. German naval Enigma messages were able to be read from 1941 onwards because of Turing's work, prompting Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower to comment after the war that breaking the Enigma code was a decisive part of the Allies' victory over the Germans. Before the war, Turing invented a hypothetical computing device that became known as the Universal Turing Machine, and after the war's conclusion, he continued to build on his earlier work, eventually publishing a design for what he called an automatic computing engine, a clear forerunner to the modern computer of today. In 1952, Turing was arrested for homosexuality and found guilty of gross indecency. The conviction was overturned when he agreed to undergo chemical castration. In 1954, he was found dead from cyanide poisoning, which was later ruled a suicide. Miracle at Dunkirk. In late April of 1940, as Britain struggled for survival against relentless Nazi aggression, Germany began its invasion of the Low Countries, prompting French and British forces to move into Belgium to repel the attack. In classic diversionary blitzkrieg fashion, German forces then smashed through the Allies' weak point in the Ardennes, effectively surrounding Allied forces at the French port of Dunkirk, their backs desperately pinned to the English Channel. By May 19th, as the Nazis charged across Belgium, they cut off all communication and transport links between the northern and southern branches of the Allied force, prompting Winston Churchill to weigh the odds of an evacuation in light of certain annihilation of the hundreds of thousands of men now trapped at Dunkirk. In response, Operation Dynamo began on May 26 under the direction of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, with bleak expectations of evacuating no more than 45,000 troops. Instead, a confluence of good fortune led to the successful evacuation of some 338,000 men as they clung to the beachhead under constant bombardment by the still dominant Luftwaffe. Aided by 800 to 1,200 vessels, including leisure and fishing crafts manned primarily by British naval personnel, the unusually gentle weather conditions allowed small boats to pick up men in minimal surf conditions before ferrying them out to larger vessels. A second saving grace was Ramsay's creative use of Dunkirk's harbor mole or breakwater, which allowed larger ships to onboard men at a much faster pace, while Hitler's halt order to his advancing troops gave the Allies a merciful reprieve from what Churchill called a miracle of deliverance. Fully expecting a frosty reception on their defeated homecoming, publicly vilified with their tail between their legs, instead, the rescued men found themselves welcomed home like heroes, all at a time when Great Britain was in desperate need of a major morale boost, a little more than a month before their fight for survival in the Battle of Britain. Given the vast amount of equipment and weaponry left behind at Dunkirk, some historians believe that the loss of so many war assets left Britain open for immediate invasion by Nazi forces, had the Germans had the plans or will or ability to advance on England, making the miracle at Dunkirk a vital morale boost to a nation's dogged sense of freedom. The Battle of Britain. After the Germans had rapidly overwhelmed France and the Low Countries of Europe, the Nazis set their sights on the overthrow of Great Britain. Heralded as the first major military campaign fought entirely by air forces, the Battle of Britain ignited on July 10, 1940, before terrorizing the British for the next nearly 4 months to come. Fought between the German Luftwaffe, the British Royal Air Force, and the British Navy's Fleet Air Army, Hitler's primary objective for the campaign was to compel Britain to agree to a negotiated peace settlement, targeting coastal shipping convoys, ports, and shipping centers such as Portsmouth. On August 1st, the Luftwaffe was directed to achieve air superiority over the RAF, with the aim of incapacitating the RAF Fighter Command. 12 days later, it shifted their attacks to RAF airfields and infrastructure, which included the attempted destruction of British aircraft production facilities. After both German objectives failed, the Nazis shifted their focus to terror bombing raids over British cities, hoping that the resultant public outcry and political pressure would force politicians to capitulate. On July 16, 1940, Hitler ordered that preparations be made for Operation Sea Lion, which was the planned amphibious and airborne assault on Great Britain. In September, however, the RAF Bomber Command disrupted the Nazis' invasion plans during a series of punishing night raids on a flotilla of converted barges being outfitted for the coastal invasion of Britain. Combined with the Luftwaffe's failure to gain air superiority over the Brits, Hitler abruptly canceled all plans for Operation Sea Lion. Historian Stephen Bungay cited Germany's failure to destroy Britain's air defenses as the first major German defeat in World War II, while injecting a crucial turning point in the conflict in Europe. The Battle of Britain takes its name from a speech given by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to the House of Commons on June 18, 1940, when he said, "When General Weygand called the Battle of France over, I suspect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." The Battle of Britain would see 1,964 airmen casualties for the British, while the Germans suffered casualties of 4,245. 14,286 British civilians were killed during the 4-month running campaign, while an additional 20,325 British civilians were wounded. Despite these egregious losses, the victory in favor of Britain provided an enormous morale boost for the nation, emboldening their confidence that they could and would successfully defend themselves from Nazi aggression. Louis Zamperini survives the unimaginable. Born in 1917, Louis Zamperini was a tough kid out of Torrance, California. A smoker by age 5, Louis was always getting into fights, while his favorite trick was stealing beer from bootleggers. When the chief of police and his high school principal tried to redirect the misguided youth into track and field, after a shaky start due to his long history of smoking, in 1934, Louis broke the world interscholastic mile record of 4 minutes 21 seconds, a record that would stand for the next 2 decades. Soon afterwards, the Torrance Tornado, as he was nicknamed, qualified for the 1936 Olympic Games, taking 8th place in the 5,000-meter race, but only after he ran the last quarter mile in just 56 seconds. The feat prompted a face-to-face meeting with Adolf Hitler, just 3 years before Nazi troops would blitzkrieg their way into Poland. After war broke out, Louis left USC and joined the Army Air Corps in the Pacific Theater, earning the nickname Lucky Louie after cheating death multiple times as a bombardier until his luck ran out on May 27, 1943. On a search and rescue mission 800 miles from land, his B-24 went down at sea, killing 8 crew members but sparing Louis, the pilot Russell Phillips, and tail gunner Francis McNamara. The survivors floated in a life raft for 27 days, surviving on albatross meat and small fish, including the livers of small sharks they caught by hand. On the 27th day at sea, their luck turned south yet again, when they were spotted by Japanese fighters. The 3 men were strafed in a 30-minute assault, but thinking the castaways were dead, the Japanese finally left them alone. Miraculously, all 3 men had made it through the attack without a scratch. 6 days later, McNamara passed away on their 33rd day adrift, and as bad luck would have it, on their 47th day, having drifted some 2,000 miles to the Marshall Islands, they were made prisoners of war by the Japanese. Louis weighed just 65 pounds, and after being transferred to Execution Island, so named because most prisoners of war that were taken there were executed by decapitation with a samurai sword, Louis and other Allied prisoners were abused daily and kept on a starvation diet. On 3 occasions, Louis was subjected to medical experiments, but after 47 days on Execution Island, Louis was transferred to a prisoner of war camp, where he and others were horribly tortured by Mutsuhiro Watanabe, aka the Bird, an experience so horrifying that Louis still could not bring himself to talk about his experiences, even 50 years after the war. After the Japanese tried to use his Olympic fame in a propaganda radio broadcast, Louis refused and was reassigned to a labor camp. Out of spite, the Japanese transferred the Bird to Louis' camp, where the torture would begin anew. Freed at war's end, Louis married a Miami socialite and began drinking heavily as a way to chase the Bird and his memories of torture from his mind. With his marriage on the rocks, after his wife converted to Christ, Louis followed his wife's lead and converted as well.
I made my confession of faith in Christ. I knew I'd forgiven them. I knew it. I knew I was through getting drunk, I was through smoking, and I had a whole new life now.
Our Day. After Hitler's 1939 invasion of Poland and the Nazis' subsequent blitzkrieg invasions across Europe, an American nation once divided over the issue of isolationism versus intervention began to realize that the later was inevitable, given the clear good against evil reflection of unprovoked Axis aggression. As a result, on October 16, 1940, all American men between the ages of 21 and 35 were required to register for the nation's first peacetime selective service draft on what became known as Our Day.
You have the confidence and the gratitude and the love of your countrymen. We are all with you in the task which enlists the services of all Americans, the task of keeping the peace in this new world of ours.
The level of patriotic cooperation became instantly notable, as rich and poor, famous and unheralded, lined up as one at registration centers across the nation. 113,000 men queued up at 47 registration centers in the District of Columbia, despite the misery of a pounding cold rain. 500,000 queued in Chicago, where examiners asked each man a dozen questions, noting a registrant's build as slender, medium, or stout, while recording a registrant's race as white, Negro, Oriental, Indian, or Filipino. Each man was handed a wallet-sized draft card that quickly became a form of valid identification as a man's legal or illegal status for the purchase of alcohol. Journalists followed the registration of famous actors, athletes, and financiers, including John Wayne, Henry Fonda, Don Amici, and heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, who made the front page of most national newspapers the following morning under the caption, "He's a fighter for you, Uncle Sam." As the day wore on, 500 World War I veterans delivered a 10-gallon fishbowl into Philadelphia's Independence Hall, the same one used during the World War I draft of 1919, where a blindfolded Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, pulled celluloid capsules from the fishbowl before handing them one by one to FDR. The first number drawn was 158, and while many American men were drafted into the military with each successive lottery draw, the lingering effects of the Great Depression witnessed more than 71,000 unemployed American men volunteer for military service during the early weeks of the draft, hoping for training in future careers ranging from cooks to mechanics to pilots, making Registration Day a defining step toward America's eventual entry into the Second World War. America enters World War II. As more than 2,000 American soldiers and sailors lay dead among the burned ruins of Pearl Harbor's battleships, planes, and airfields, President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew that there could be but one response.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Less than 24 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, delivering an impassioned oratorical display that demanded a declaration of war against Japan.
The unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Within an hour after his speech, Roosevelt had his declaration of war. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, who in turn declared war on all Axis powers. Across the nation, young men poured into recruiting stations, eager to stick it to the enemy. Hollywood became a contributing propaganda arm, stirring the fires of patriotism with movies promoting the war effort.
Don't kid yourself. The doc says I'm in perfect shape.
That's the stuff, Harry. Stick around. I'll be right with you.
You mean you're joining up?
Well, sure. They can't keep me out now. Next!
Women joined the workforce, famously led by Rosie the Riveter. By early 1942, America implemented a rationing system, everything from rubber to gasoline, butter and bread. Leisure time was slashed dramatically as a nation came together to build the machines necessary for an Allied victory.
We are now in this war. We're all in it, all the way. Every single man, woman, and child is a partner in the most tremendous undertaking of our American history.
On December 8, 1941, the United States joined a war that by its very breadth and scope would cost the lives of 60 million people, while ultimately excising a gruesome evil. At war's end, 4 long years later, life in America and around the world would never be the same. Pearl Harbor. After years of imposed trade sanctions by the United States in response to Japan's expansionist aggression in China and Southeast Asia, the Empire of Japan came to the conclusion that the only way to increase their influence in the region was to take out the Americans' Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After months of planning and practice, at 8 a.m. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes filled the sky over Honolulu, wreaking havoc on the Americans' idle and unsuspecting Pacific Fleet. At 8:10, an 1,800-pound bomb careened through the forward deck of the USS Arizona, exploding an ammunition magazine before sending 1,000 sailors to a watery grave. Just as the Arizona slipped beneath the surface, torpedoes fired by 2-man Japanese subs took out the battleship USS Oklahoma, which in turn rolled onto her side with 400 sailors on board. The 2-wave attack by 353 Japanese warplanes was over in less than 2 hours, crippling or destroying nearly 19 American ships and more than 188 aircraft, taking the lives of 2,403 sailors, soldiers, and civilians, while wounding an additional 1,178 people. Fortunately for the Americans, all of her Pacific Fleet aircraft carriers were out to sea at the time of the attack, some which had returned to the mainland, while others were delivering warplanes to troops stationed on Midway and Wake Islands. A secondary plus was that the Japanese attack failed to damage the Americans' vital onshore facilities, such as oil storage tanks, repair shops, shipyards, and submarine pens, which allowed the American Navy to rebound relatively quickly after the attack. Within 6 months, 5 battleships and 2 cruisers were patched and refloated so that they could be sent to shipyards in Pearl Harbor or on the west coast of the United States. Intensive salvage operations continued for another year, witnessing a total of some 20,000 man-hours by underwater divers. A day later, at the beginning of a speech to Congress requesting a declaration of war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered a speech which still resonates within the collective minds of Americans.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
On December 8, 1941, the United States Congress declared war on the Empire of Japan, officially entering World War II in both the Pacific and European theaters of war, which would ultimately result in the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Axis nations, followed by Japan's surrender after nuclear bomb detonations over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All told, during the 5+ years of World War II, 70 to 85 million people would lose their lives to the madness of war. Friendly fire casualties at Pearl Harbor. After years of imposed trade sanctions by the United States, in response to Japan's expansionist aggression in China and Southeast Asia, the Empire of Japan came to the conclusion that the only way to increase their influence in the region was to take out the Americans' Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. After months of planning and practice, at 8 a.m. Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, Japanese warplanes filled the sky over Honolulu, wreaking havoc on the Americans' idle and unsuspecting Pacific Fleet warships. The two-wave attack by 353 Japanese warplanes was over in less than 2 hours, crippling or destroying nearly 19 American ships and more than 188 aircraft, taking the lives of 2,403 sailors and soldiers, while wounding an additional 1,178 more. During the attack, to heap misfortune upon misfortune, a day earlier, the Navy had undertaken a large-scale air defense exercise before giving anti-aircraft battery crews town leave beginning on the evening of December 6, leaving the defense of Pearl Harbor in the hands of 5-inch naval guns, which were designed to engage surface targets rather than Japanese dive bombers. During the heat of battle, both time fuse and contact artillery shells took over the role of Honolulu's idled anti-aircraft batteries, and while 55 Japanese airmen were killed during the attack, civilian casualties in Honolulu and elsewhere took direct hits by the fuselage of shells that missed enemy targets and landed in the streets surrounding Pearl Harbor. 32 people died in Honolulu during the attack, including a 3-month-old baby, while another 36 civilians were killed in other communities surrounding the harbor, including Japanese-American restaurateur Chitsuo Hirosaki, who was killed instantly when a 55-pound shell exploded inside his diner. 3 of his children were killed in the explosion, along with their 14-year-old cousin and 7 young men who just happened to be eating breakfast. A day later, at the beginning of his speech to Congress requesting a declaration of war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered a speech which still resonates within the collective minds of Americans, making friendly fire casualties at Pearl Harbor yet another tragic loss of life during the insanity of war. Today in the Daily Dose, the Lease Act of 1941. In the decades following the First World War, many Americans remained extremely wary of becoming involved in any costly international conflicts, preferring a policy of isolationism from outside world events. But after Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the first step in the Nazis' blitzkrieg sweep across Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that while the United States would remain neutral by law, it was impossible that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Before passage of the Neutrality Act of 1939, Roosevelt persuaded Congress to allow the sale of military supplies to allies, like France and Britain, on a cash-and-carry basis, which meant that they paid cash for American-made supplies before transporting their purchases across the Atlantic on their own ships. By the summer of 1940, France had fallen to the Nazis, leaving Britain to fight virtually alone against the Hun, both on land, sea, and in the air. After the new British Prime Minister Winston Churchill appealed personally to Roosevelt for help, FDR agreed to exchange more than 50 outdated American destroyers for 99-year leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland, which would also be used as U.S. air and naval facilities. In mid-December 1940, Roosevelt introduced a new policy initiative whereby the United States would lend rather than sell military supplies to Great Britain for use in the fight against Nazi aggression. Payment for the supplies would be deferred, while repayment could come in any form Roosevelt deemed acceptable.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
Despite heavy opposition among isolationist legislators, in March of 1941, Congress passed the Lease Act, and Roosevelt quickly signed it into law. 6 months later, America would formally enter World War II after Japan's unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, instantly and forever removing the notion of isolationism from the American political landscape. The Night Witches of World War II. When Adolf Hitler launched his invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets were desperate for any means of pushback against the advancing Nazi army. Known as the Soviet Amelia Earhart, record-breaking female aviator Marina Raskova proposed an all-female bomber force, and when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin gave her the nod, Raskova quickly set about building out her team of daring flyers. Of 2,000 applicants, mainly women who had lost brothers or sweethearts to Nazi aggression, Raskova handpicked 400 for advanced flight training, which would be compressed into months rather than years. Flying under the cover of darkness in bare-bones Polikarpov World War I-era biplanes, the women braved bullets and frostbite in the air, while receiving skepticism and sexual harassment back on the ground. Named Nachthexen, or night witches by the Nazis, due to the broom-like whooshing sound their planes made during bombing runs, the all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment became a crucial element of the Soviets' offensive strategy. Outfitted in oversized male uniforms and boots, the Night Witches flew in teams of 2, a pilot up front, the navigator and bombardier in the rear, flying without parachutes or radios, the later making them nearly impossible to spot using ground-based radio locators. Their open cockpit biplanes gave the women no protection from the frigid conditions aloft, forcing the women to contend with wind and frostbite on a nightly basis. During the bitterly cold Soviet winters, the planes became so cold that just touching them without gloves could rip off bare skin. On the plus side, their planes were slower than the stall speeds of Nazi warplanes, making them extremely difficult to shoot down. While on the negative side, if one of the plywood and canvas planes did take on incendiary fire from the enemy, the old planes would burst into flames and fall from the sky. With a payload of only 2 bombs per plane, the regiment sent up 40 planes per mission, executing between 8 and 18 missions a night. The Night Witches traveled in formations, sending a single bait plane over the target in advance to attract German defensive spotlights, which further helped the bomber formation locate their targets. After the bait plane dropped a flare to illuminate the intended drop zone, the bombers would idle their engines to glide in over their targets, which was a stealth tactic that gave the Night Witches their signature witch's broom sound. All told, the Night Witches dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on Nazi frontline positions, making the Soviet Union the first country in the world to allow women in combat. By the end of the war, the Night Witches flew more than 30,000 missions, losing 30 pilots before their last flight on May 4th, 1945, making the Night Witches a crucial asset in the Allies' victory over Nazi aggression.